When I was 6 years old, my parents moved us into an old white house on the outskirts of a small town in Kentucky. The kind of place surrounded by trees instead of neighbors, where nights felt longer than they should and silence pressed against your ears. And from the very first week, I remember feeling uncomfortable in my bedroom. Not scared exactly, just watched like someone else knew I was there and was patiently waiting for something. And my room sat at the end of a narrow hallway with creaky wooden floors and a closet door that never stayed fully shut no matter how many times my mother tried to fix it. And every night I would lie in bed staring at that dark crack between the door and the frame, convincing myself that if something was there it would stay hidden as long as I didn't look directly at it. But that sense of safety disappeared the night I woke up suddenly at 3:14 a.m. to the sound of breathing that wasn't mine, slow and deliberate, coming from the foot of my bed. And when I opened my eyes, I saw a man standing there, tall and unnaturally thin, his arms hanging too low, his shoulders slouched like his spine couldn't fully hold him upright, and his face was barely visible in the darkness except for his eyes, which reflected just enough light for me to know he was staring directly at me. And I tried to scream, but nothing came out, my throat completely locked. And after what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, he took one slow step backward into the darkness near my closet and vanished. And when morning came, I told my parents everything, but my dad laughed and said it was a nightmare. And my mom said moving stress can make kids imagine things. So I tried to believe them until the man came back the next night and the next, always at 3:14, always standing a little closer, sometimes at the foot of my bed, sometimes right beside it. And I started sleeping with my blanket pulled over my head, even though I knew it wouldn't protect me. Because somehow pretending I couldn't see him felt safer than seeing him clearly. And weeks passed, and I stopped sleeping properly. My grades dropped, I stopped playing outside, and my parents started arguing quietly at night about how pale and exhausted I looked. And then one night, I gathered the courage to peek out from under the blanket, and that was the first time I saw his face clearly, his skin stretched tight and gray like old paper, his mouth pulled into a smile that showed no teeth, just darkness inside, and his eyes were bloodshot and wet, filled with something that looked like hunger, and in a voice so quiet it felt like it came from inside my head, he whispered my name, Caleb, and that was when I wet the bed out of pure terror. And instead of leaving, he tilted his head slowly and smiled wider. And the next morning my parents found long muddy footprints leading from my bedroom window to the foot of my bed. But even then they tried to rationalize it, my dad saying, someone must have broken in, though nothing was missing. And after that they installed locks on my windows and kept my bedroom door closed at night. But the man didn't stop coming because locks didn't matter to him. And soon I started waking up before 3:14, my body somehow knowing he was coming. And I would lie there listening to the house grow quiet, the air thick and cold, waiting for that breathing to start again. And then my little sister, Emily, who was 4 at the time, began waking up, crying, telling my mom that a long man stood in her doorway at night and told her not to tell anyone. And that was when my mom finally looked scared because she admitted something she had never told us before, that she used to see a man just like that when she was a child in the same house, and that her parents moved away suddenly without explanation, and that night my dad decided to stay awake with a baseball bat, determined to prove it was all in our heads. And I remember lying in bed listening to him pace the hallway until everything went silent at exactly 3:14 a.m. No insects, no wind, no sound at all. And then I heard my dad stop walking, and a long pause followed. And then the bat hit the floor with a loud crack, and my dad began screaming, not words, just raw animal terror. And the next morning he wouldn't tell us what he saw, only that we were leaving immediately. And we moved out that same day, abandoning furniture, clothes, everything. And for years after that I tried to forget, telling myself it was childhood fear amplified by imagination. Until I grew up, my parents passed away, and I returned to Kentucky as an adult to settle old property paperwork. And curiosity pulled me back to that house, now abandoned and rotting. And when I stepped inside, the smell of mold and damp would hit me instantly. And I walked down that familiar hallway toward my old room, every step heavier than the last. And inside my bedroom, I found deep scratch marks carved in the wall beside the bed. Marks that hadn't been there before, and written beneath them in uneven letters was a message that made my blood run cold. You were supposed to stay. And before I could react, I heard breathing behind me, slow and patient. And when I turned around, I saw the man standing at the end of the bed again, exactly as he had when I was 6, unchanged by time, smiling wider than ever, and in that same quiet voice he whispered, "You grew up, but I waited." When I was 10 years old, my family lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in northern Illinois, the kind of place where every house looked almost identical and parents felt safe letting their kids roam until sunset. And my best friends at the time were two brothers named Eric and Matthew Collins who lived 3 houses down from me. And almost every afternoon after school, we would end up in their basement because their parents worked late and the basement felt like our own private world, unfinished and cold with concrete floors, exposed wooden beams, a humming furnace in the corner, and shelves stacked with old boxes that belonged to people none of us really remembered. And at first the basement was just another place to play video games, trade creepy stories, and dare each other to explore the darkest corners with the lights off. But everything changed the day we found the door behind the shelves. A narrow wooden door, half hidden by paint cans and broken furniture that none of us had noticed before. And when Eric pulled the shelf aside and tried the handle, it opened easily, revealing a small, windowless room that smelled like dust and something rotten underneath. And carved into the walls were dozens of names, scratched deep into the wood, as if someone had used their fingernails. And at the center of the room was a single chair facing the wall. And we laughed nervously and joked about it being a prank by some previous owner, but the laughter felt forced in that night when I went home, I couldn't stop thinking about those names because one of them looked unfinished, as if whoever carved it had been interrupted. And the next day, Matthew admitted that after we left, he heard whispering coming from that room, whispering that sounded like children arguing softly. And instead of telling an adult like we should have, we did what stupid kids always do and went back down there together. And this time when we opened the hidden door, the chair had been turned around, facing us, and written freshly into the wall above it were 3 names. Eric, Matthew, and mine, carved so deeply that splinters hung loose from the wood, and my stomach dropped, but Eric insisted someone was messing with us, maybe his older cousin, and to prove it he sat in the chair, laughing, saying nothing was going to happen, and the moment he sat down, the basement lights flickered violently, and the furnace shut off, plunging the entire basement into silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then a voice spoke from the walls, not loud, not angry, just patient, calling Eric's name slowly, syllable by syllable, and Eric's laughter stopped instantly, his face going pale as his eyes locked onto something we couldn't see, and Matthew started crying, pulling at Eric's arm, but Eric didn't move, didn't blink, didn't respond. And then the lights snapped back on, and Eric slumped forward in the chair like a puppet with its strings cut. And when we ran upstairs screaming for help, his parents rushed down, but found nothing wrong except that Eric refused to speak. And from that day on, he was different, withdrawn and hollow, spending hours staring at the basement door, whispering to himself at night. And within weeks, he began sleepwalking, always heading for the basement. And one night, Matthew followed him and saw Eric standing in that hidden room, carving his own name deeper and deeper into the wall, his fingers bleeding. And when Matthew tried to pull him away, Eric turned and spoke in a voice that wasn't his, telling Matthew that the basement needed a new listener and that it was tired of waiting. And not long after that, Matthew disappeared, his bed untouched, his shoes still by the door. And the police searched the neighborhood for weeks, but found nothing. And the Collins family moved away soon after, sealing the basement door with concrete before they left. But years later, as an adult, I returned to that house out of morbid curiosity after it was put up for sale. And when I convinced the realtor to let me see the basement alone, I noticed faint tapping coming from behind a concrete wall, where the hidden room used to be, slow and rhythmic like fingers knocking from the inside. And then I heard a familiar voice whisper my name through the wall, followed by another voice I recognized as Matthew's, softly begging me not to leave them alone down there. And as I backed toward the stairs in terror, I saw fresh cracks spreading across the concrete, and scratched through them were letters forming my name, unfinished, waiting for me to come closer and take my turn in the chair. When I was 5 years old, my family moved into a quiet neighborhood outside of Spokane, Washington, a place where every house had a white fence, trimmed lawns, and the illusion of safety that makes parents careless. And that was the summer I met my best friend Noah, a boy my exact age who lived in an empty house directly behind ours. And I remember the first time I saw him standing near the tree line at the edge of the woods, staring at me as if he had already known me for a long time, smiling softly and waving like we had met before, and without thinking I waved back and walked over. And from that day on, Noah was always there waiting for me after school, sitting with me in my backyard, whispering ideas for games, daring me to sneak out at night, and telling me things that felt important but never quite made sense, like how the woods weren't empty and how some children don't grow up unless they're remembered. And at first my parents were happy I had made a friend so quickly. But they found it strange that Noah never came over for dinner, never spoke to them directly, and never entered our house, always stopping at the back door as if there was an invisible line he couldn't cross. And whenever my mom asked about his parents, I would struggle to answer, because Noah said talking about them made him uncomfortable, and over time I noticed other small things that felt wrong, like how Noah wore the same faded blue jacket every single day, no matter the weather, how he never seemed to get sick or tired, and how he knew the layout of our neighborhood better than anyone, including places that had been torn down years before we moved there. And when I turned 7 and started second grade, Noah didn't go to school. He would just wait for me behind the fence every afternoon, unchanged, still looking exactly the same while I grew taller, lost baby teeth, and slowly began to realize that something about him didn't follow the rules. And when I asked him why he never aged, he told me growing up was dangerous, that kids who grew up forgot important things, and that forgetting was worse than dying. And that night, I had a nightmare where I was lost in the woods, calling Noah's name while something answered back in his voice from all directions. And after that, the dreams didn't stop, and my parents noticed the bruises on my arms shaped like small hands, marks I couldn't explain. And when my mom asked if Noah had hurt me, I laughed it off because the idea felt impossible, like accusing your own shadow of attacking you. But Noah began to change, becoming possessive, angry when I spent time with other kids, whispering cruel things about my classmates, telling me they didn't matter and that friends always leave unless you make them stay. And one afternoon he showed me something behind the trees, a small clearing with the ground dipped unnaturally low, and at the center was a rotting wooden playhouse half buried in the earth. And Noah told me that was where he lived, and inside the playhouse the walls were covered in childish drawings of stick figures holding hands, all crossed out except 2, and written underneath in messy crayon were the words "best friends forever." And I felt sick standing there. But Noah just smiled and asked me to promise I'd never leave him. And when I hesitated, he grabbed my wrist harder than any child should be able to and whispered that he had waited a very long time for me. And things escalated the year I turned 10, when my parents finally decided to move after my grades dropped and I started sleepwalking, always found standing in the backyard facing the woods. And when I told Noah we were leaving, his smile disappeared for the first time and his face went flat and empty. And that night he came to my bedroom window, tapping softly, telling me I didn't have to go if I stayed with him. And when I refused, he screamed, not loud, but sharp, like metal scraping glass. And for weeks after that, strange things happened in the house. Objects moved, whispers followed me room to room, and my parents fought constantly about me. And on the last night, before we moved, Noah asked me to meet him one final time at the playhouse, and against every instinct I went. And when I arrived, he told me the truth, that he had once been a real boy who lived in our house decades ago, that his parents forgot him, ignored him, and eventually he disappeared, without anyone noticing. And that forgotten children don't die properly. They stay, waiting for someone to remember them long enough to take their place. And before I could run, he pushed me toward the playhouse, screaming that it was my turn to stay, and I don't remember how I escaped, only waking up in a hospital with my parents crying beside me, and the woods behind our house burned down days later by authorities who found human remains buried near the playhouse. And for years I convinced myself Noah was a hallucination, a trauma response, until recently, now as an adult with a child of my own, when my son told me he met a boy named Noah who waits behind our new house and says he used to be my best friend, and that tonight he wants to come inside.